Hello, this is a little film about the module Revivalism and Reform in Britain and America, 1730 to 1860, just to give you some idea about what it's about if you're thinking about taking it. So obviously the twin themes that we're looking at in the module are revivalism and reform, and you might wonder why I chose to link those two. Was it the desire to get a nice alliterative title? Well, not entirely. It strikes me that they are two of the most significant and also widely written about things in the period 1730 to 1850. So in our suite of modules which look at the modern church, this is obviously the one that comes first in that sequence. Now, revivalism probably takes up slightly more than half of the space in the module, certainly in the 30 credit version. And as you'll have noticed from the title, it's in Britain and America. Probably worth saying that the America is really a kind of secondary theme. Britain is really a primary theme, but it's because of the nature of revivalism as an international phenomenon that we are obviously also looking at the American context, which takes up two of the units. So revivalism is very interesting. One of the fascinating things about it at this period, of course, is that it does become, from during the 1730s, this extraordinary global phenomenon, spreading from Germany through to Georgia and other parts of America, and also into England and Wales and Scotland. And so the first two units consider the American context. So the Great Awakening, and you will be reading Jonathan Edwards, and you'll also be reading John Wesley, who of course went to Georgia as a missionary. So you'll be reading some of his missionary diaries from his rather traumatic experiences that he had in Georgia. And then in the second unit, we move on to the Second Great Awakening, which is a couple of decades later. And then it's a different style of American revivalism, really. It's sort of new measure revivalism. And that's associated with Finney particularly, who has an enormous impact, of course, in America, but also in England, and I think he probably would have done in Wales as well, if he hadn't been prevented by the language barrier, because really to get revivalism going in Wales at this point, you needed to be a Welsh speaker. And there's a bit of a change of gear with Unit 3 when we move on to 18th century moral and ecclesiastical reform initiatives. So we're now back in Britain, and we are looking at people like William Wilberforce and Hannah More and their campaigns to end slavery and improve education, those sorts of things. And of course they are both evangelicals, so they're fired up with revivalist fervour, but they are also interested in, they are in a way the bridge between revivalism and reform, because they are interested in the beginnings of social and institutional reform. To say just church reform would be to put it too narrowly, because obviously also, people like Wilberforce and More had a much broader agenda for reforming society and suppressing vice and all those sorts of things. Then in Unit 4 we move on to ecclesiastical reform 1800 to 1840, so into the kind of key period of the 1830s when you get the ecclesiastical commission set up, and you have that's really the great age of ecclesiastical reform, with various bits of parliamentary legislation which make it possible for the Church of England to change itself out of all recognition, in fact, over time. Doesn't happen immediately, but that really sets the church on the path to becoming a somewhat more reformed institution. And at the same time, we're also looking at other, although we do this rather as a secondary theme, it's fair to say, we're looking at other types of institutional reform, of course, parliamentary reform, reform of the poor law, and the other sorts of things that were happening around that time. And the two the two contemporary sources that we read for that are Thomas Arnold with his Plan for Church Reform in 1833 and John Henry Newman, Tract 1, also 1833. I think it's quite interesting to see how two Anglican churchmen writing in the same year, educated at the same university, could be so different in their vision for what the church should be. Then as we move into Unit 5, for people who are doing the 30 credit version of this, we look at the revivals. We go back to the revival theme and we look at the great period of revivals at the end of the 1850s, so 1858 to 60, the 1859 Ulster revival, and some of its currents, because that also is a revival which spread more broadly. And we look at William Gibson's account of the Ulster revival in 1859. And then in Unit 6, I've tried to sort of pull it all together by writing a unit about reform and revival, their later developments. So that's essentially the module in a nutshell. There are 4 set books that go with it, but don't worry if you think 4 set books is rather a lot. One of them is also going to be useful if you do the 19th century module, the one on Christianity and the social question. So there is a potential overlap there with your reading. So that is the module, and if you take it, I hope you will find it of interest.